What if everything you thought was unbreakable finally snapped? What if a father's patience, a king's authority, and a son's defiance collided so violently that the result wasn't just a royal dispute, but a full-blown exile? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine waking up one morning expecting the usual tension, the usual whispered headlines, the usual royal back and forth, only to discover that overnight, the king has taken an action so unprecedented that even palace insiders struggled to believe it was real. A royal son, born into privilege, tradition, ceremony, suddenly stripped of everything that once defined him. And the most shocking part? It didn't happen in public. It didn't happen on camera. It happened behind closed doors, quietly, decisively, and with consequences that the world is only beginning to understand. Because this wasn't just a disagreement. It wasn't a family argument. This was the king drawing a line in the sand. But what drives a father to take the most drastic step imaginable? What forces a monarch, a man who spent his entire life preparing to embody unity, to turn to the one place he hoped he'd never have to? Punishment? Today, we're diving into the moment King Charles ended every remaining privilege, protection, and courtesy once extended to Prince Harry. And why palace insiders whispered that the decision amounts to a quiet ban from the UK itself. But we're not beginning at the end. We're not starting with the announcement. We're starting with the spark. Because this story doesn't make sense until you understand the tension that's been building for years. The fraught history, the emotional fractures, the missed calls, broken promises, late-night messages, and silent treatment that slowly turned tiny cracks into a shattering break. So let's rewind. Not to the beginning, because that's too far, but to the moment everything shifted. Picture this, a gray London morning. The kind where the clouds don't move, the air is too still, and the palace gates seem heavier than usual. Staff move quietly, not out of respect, but anticipation, the kind that hangs like humidity before a storm. Inside the king's private study, an urgent document sits on the desk. Not sealed, not stamped. Already opened, already read. Already deeply, irreversibly decided upon. And if you were in that room, if you were close enough to see the look on King Charles's face as he read it one final time, you'd notice something subtle, something dangerous. Resolve. Because as gentle as Charles often appears, as mild as he sometimes seems, history shows us that he is not a man who forgets, not a man who ignores, and certainly not a man who tolerates disloyalty once it crosses the line from personal pain into institutional damage. So the question we must ask is simple. What, exactly, pushed him to the point of no return? Some say it was the interviews. Some say it was the memoir. Some say it was the criticism, thinly veiled or painfully direct. Others whisper it was something far more serious, something not yet public, something that forced the king's hand. But the truth, as always, is layered. This was not a single moment. This was 1,000 moments. And while the world debated who was right or wrong, who was justified or reckless, something bigger was happening inside the monarchy itself. A rising fear that if boundaries weren't drawn now, the institution would lose control of its own destiny. That fear turned into meetings. Meetings turned into warnings. Warnings turned into consequences. Until finally, the consequences became irreversible. But before we reach that announcement, the one that shook both royal observers and Harry's most loyal supporters, we need to understand the weight of what was at stake. Because royal privileges aren't just perks. They're not just titles, security, or ceremonial gestures. They are pieces of identity, pieces of belonging, pieces of the invisible contract between the crown and its heirs. And when those pieces are removed one by one, what's left is not just a prince without privileges, but a man without a place. Ask yourself this. Have you ever felt the sting of being cut off? Of losing something you thought would always be yours? Now imagine that feeling magnified by millions watching, judging, analyzing. That's the emotional landscape we're stepping into. But here's what makes this moment uniquely explosive. It didn't happen during a public crisis. It didn't happen after a scandal erupted across tabloids. It didn't come as retaliation for a sudden attack. It came quietly, strategically, after months, maybe years, of frustration finally reaching the pressure point where a king, a father, and a global symbol could no longer remain still. And inside this storm is Harry himself, a man caught between identity and independence, rebellion and responsibility, anger and isolation. Because whether you see him as a rebel, a victim, a truth-teller, or a provocateur, one thing is undeniable. His relationship with the monarchy shaped him, and his break from it redefined him. So when the king made his final decision, the decision to remove privileges, access, courtesies, and yes, even his ability to freely return to the UK as he once did, it wasn't just an administrative move. It was symbolic, personal, painful, and permanent, at least for now. But was it justified? Was it necessary? Is it fair? These are the questions we'll explore. Not with certainty, but with nuance, tension, and the understanding that in families, especially royal ones, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Because beneath the headlines is a much deeper story, one of power, legacy, loyalty, generational trauma, and two men who love each other, resent each other, and cannot understand each other. Not anymore. And just when you think you've grasped the complexity of their conflict, something even more shocking emerges. The king did not simply cut Harry off. He warned him, a warning that insiders say carried a weight far heavier than any public statement. A warning that hinted at consequences yet to unfold. A warning that forced Harry to reconsider choices he once made without hesitation. But before we reach that private message, the one whispered about behind palace walls, we must understand the events leading to it. Because, as with any story involving royalty, context matters. Every decision echoes through generations. Every choice affects the monarchy's future. Every misstep creates ripples that last far longer than the headlines. So as we step deeper into the story, into the escalating tension, the divided advisors, the emotional fallout, and the decisions made in silence, keep one thing in mind. No one comes out of this unscathed. Not the king, not Harry, not the monarchy, not the future heirs watching closely from the sidelines. And what happens next? What unfolds after the king's final decision will alter the royal family's path in ways none of them can reverse. Because there is one more twist, one more turning point, one more revelation that reshapes this entire narrative. And that moment is where our story truly begins. But before we get there, you need to see the spark, the letter, the confrontation, the decision that pushed everything over the edge. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with an envelope, ordinary at first glance, cream-colored, unmarked, resting quietly on the polished desk in a room no one ever expected to make history. But inside that simple paper lay the catalyst that would unravel years of careful diplomacy, family patience, and royal tradition. A single letter, and everything would shift. Imagine opening your mail one morning and realizing that nothing will ever be the same. Not your schedule, not your privileges, not the people who promised loyalty. That's what Harry faced, a reality no one in his world prepares for. This was more than a message, it was a declaration. A subtle strike that would ripple through the corridors of power, the press rooms, and the hearts of those involved. The envelope had arrived quietly, discreetly, yet deliberately. Not a courier's flourish. No fanfare. Just a hand-delivered weight, the kind of item that, in the royal world, commands attention simply by existing. Its contents had been drafted with precision, every word chosen for maximum clarity, maximum consequence. The tone was calm, almost bureaucratic, yet beneath that veneer lay a storm. The first line hit like a cold wind. A polite introduction, a formal acknowledgement, the language of etiquette. But immediately, the implication was unmistakable. Privileges once assumed to be permanent were under review. Access previously guaranteed was now in question. And the subtext, far more powerful than the words themselves, was clear. The king had made a decision. Harry read it once, then again, and again. Each pass revealed a new layer. Not only were privileges being questioned, but warnings were embedded, hints of consequences that would extend beyond mere ceremony. The subtlety was exquisite. A casual observer might have dismissed the letter as standard protocol. But for those attuned to the rhythms of palace life, every comma, every line break, every choice of verb carried weight. This was a summons, and it was unmistakably personal. The letter's impact was immediate. For Harry, it wasn't just a communication, it was a mirror. a reflection of decades of choices, both his and his family's. He saw the accumulated strain between himself and his father, the quiet tension that had lingered like an uninvited shadow over every family gathering. Each word in that letter was a spotlight, illuminating cracks that had long been ignored. What made it devastating was the precision. There were no angry accusations, no overt threats, no dramatic declarations designed for public consumption. It was all deliberate, strategic, the kind of move that leaves you questioning your own actions before questioning the sender. This was power exercised not through volume, but through control, clarity, and inevitability. Inside the palace, reactions were mixed. Some advisors murmured that the letter was necessary, a reminder that no one, not even a prince, is above the rules. Others whispered doubts, warning that this move risked humiliation, resentment, and international attention. But the king's decision had been made. There was no turning back, and Harry knew it. Reading the letter, he felt a spectrum of emotions: shock, denial, anger, a sinking recognition that the balance of his world had shifted. For a man who had long navigated life with a sense of autonomy, the sudden reassertion of boundaries felt both foreign and inescapable. He questioned, how had it come to this? At what point did the accumulation of tensions, interviews, memoirs, and choices culminate in this silent, yet overwhelming message? And yet, despite the gravity, there was a strange clarity in the letter. It forced Harry to confront truths he had avoided. That privilege is conditional, that family ties are not immutable, and that actions, whether public or private, have consequences that cannot always be undone. In that quiet reading room, surrounded by polished wood and the faint scent of old leather and history, he was forced to reckon with the full weight of his life's decisions. The palace staff, unaware of the contents but sensing the tension, whispered among themselves. Courtiers speculated, aides hesitated, and security personnel maintained their silent vigilance. Every move, every glance, every carefully measured step carried the invisible charge of anticipation. The letter was more than words. It was a catalyst for action, the spark that would ignite months, maybe years, of fallout. Harry did not act immediately. He read the letter multiple times, each pass revealing nuances he had missed before. The document was masterfully written. It balanced formality with the unmistakable undertone of finality. He could feel the intent behind each line. This was not a negotiation. This was a boundary. And boundaries, once articulated by a king, are seldom ignored without consequence. But the letter also contained openings, subtle, almost imperceptible, that hinted at negotiation or dialogue, yet only if approached correctly, with humility and strategic restraint. It was a test, a provocation, and a warning, all wrapped into a single sheet of paper. How Harry would respond, carefully, impulsively, publicly, or privately, would determine the course of the next chapter of his life. The first real shock came when he realized the full extent of what was at stake. Privileges he had long taken for granted were now formally challenged. Access to certain residences, ceremonial roles, security provisions, and even his ability to freely travel to the UK were all being reconsidered. These were not minor adjustments. They were the structural pillars of royal life, being quietly dismantled. And as he sat with the letter, absorbing its implications, a single thought dominated his mind. This was irreversible. Once the king had sent this message, once the line had been drawn, there was no retreat. Every option now carried weight. Every choice had consequences. And while the document itself was elegantly composed, the reality it represented was brutal. Outside the palace walls, the world remained oblivious. Life in London continued. Traffic, tea rooms, tourists snapping photos of guards in red coats. Yet within these ancient halls, a quiet revolution was underway. The balance of power had shifted. The narrative was being rewritten, and Harry was at its epicenter. He considered his options. Should he respond immediately? Delay? Appeal to intermediaries? Every choice had ramifications, both personal and institutional. His advisors, loyal yet cautious, whispered counsel, offering strategy and foresight. But the weight of history, tradition, and familial expectation loomed larger than any advice. The letter had done more than communicate information. It had created tension, It had demanded reflection. It had forced recognition that the dynamics of family, power, and privilege were more fragile than he had imagined. For a man accustomed to autonomy, it was a startling revelation. Even royalty cannot escape the consequences of their actions. And then came the moment that would define the day, the moment of confrontation. Not public, not televised, not for press release. A private acknowledgement, a silent understanding that the letter had accomplished exactly what it was meant to. It had drawn a line. It had set the stage for the most consequential decisions of Harry's life. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It's one thing to send a letter. It's another to follow through. And in the quiet chambers of the palace, where history weighs on every wall and every decision echoes through generations, King Charles had reached a point he could no longer ignore. This wasn't a whim. This wasn't a momentary flare of anger. This was the breaking point, the culmination of years of restraint, patience, and silent endurance finally snapping under the weight of expectation, betrayal, and responsibility. The king sat alone in his study, the soft ticking of the antique clock filling the otherwise suffocating silence. Outside, the gardens glimmered under the muted light of a cloudy London afternoon. Inside, Charles considered the letter he had dispatched, the ripple it had already begun to cause, and the gravity of what he had set in motion. Every word, every punctuation mark, every implied consequence had been deliberately chosen. Yet now, as he stared at the polished wood of his desk, he understood the true weight of his decision. He had tried restraint for years. He had hoped for understanding. He had hoped for compromise. He had hoped that Harry, in time, would recognize the boundaries of his position, the responsibilities inherent in royal life, the delicate balance between personal freedom and public duty. But hope, as it turns out, has a limit, and Charles had reached it. The breaking point wasn't sudden. It had been gradual, almost imperceptible to the outside world. Small acts of defiance, subtle critiques in interviews, moments of public distancing, each one a drop in a slowly filling reservoir. And like water behind a dam, when the pressure becomes too great, there is only one outcome: a release, forceful and inevitable. Advisors had tried to intervene. They had suggested diplomacy, mediated talks, and private reconciliation. They had reminded the king of public perception, of international attention, of the delicate optics of family conflict. But Charles understood something the advisors sometimes failed to grasp. This was no longer about optics. This was about control, about integrity, about the survival of an institution larger than any one individual. The decision he faced was monumental. To enforce boundaries is one thing. To strip privileges and reassert authority in a way that reverberates through centuries of tradition is another. Yet the king knew, with absolute clarity, that the moment had arrived. The monarchy's credibility, its ability to function, and its moral authority depended on it. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the study, each step echoing in the cavernous room. Portraits of ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes silent witnesses to this modern dilemma. Charles felt the weight of history pressing on him. These weren't merely decisions about a son. These were decisions about legacy, succession, and the very identity of the crown. And failure was not an option. The king's breaking point was not born of anger alone. It was born of accumulated disappointment. Disappointment that a son, brilliant and charismatic in his own right, could not reconcile his personal ambitions with the responsibilities bestowed upon him at birth. Disappointment that repeated attempts at understanding had been met with deflection, distance, and public displays of dissent. Disappointment that the family, once united in tradition and duty, was fragmenting before his eyes. And yet, even as he considered the consequences of his actions, Charles experienced the paradox of power. The more decisive he became, the heavier the burden grew. Every act of authority carried with it the potential for backlash, the potential for resentment, the potential for history to judge him harshly. But in the same breath, hesitation risked chaos, further disrespect, and the erosion of the monarchy's dignity. There was no easy path. There never is. It was during this private reflection that the king summoned his closest advisors for a late-night meeting, one shrouded in secrecy and urgency. The room, dimly lit by crystal chandeliers, held a tension so thick it seemed almost physical. Senior aides, legal counselors, and household officials leaned forward, waiting for guidance, for instruction, for clarity. None of them could have predicted the magnitude of the decision the king was about to confirm. Charles spoke with calm authority, his voice low but unwavering. He outlined the facts, the behaviors, the breaches of expectation, the potential consequences for the institution. He explained, without flourish, why the time had come to act. And then he laid out the plan. Privileges would be revoked. Certain access points would be restricted. Messages of warning would be delivered. Boundaries would be enforced. Every word was deliberate, measured, and intended to convey both firmness and fairness. As he spoke, the advisors took notes, whispered counsel, and occasionally exchanged glances. Some were nervous, aware of the international scrutiny that would inevitably follow. Some were relieved, believing that decisive action was necessary to protect the monarchy's integrity. But all recognized the truth. Charles had crossed a line, not impulsively, but with deliberate purpose. Meanwhile, the weight of the personal dimension bore heavily upon him. This was, after all, his son. The man he had raised, guided, and sometimes disagreed with passionately. The conflict was not abstract, it was deeply intimate. Every decision was infused with emotion, disappointment, love, frustration, and a profound awareness of the potential for irreparable damage. Yet even in this moment of emotional complexity, Charles remained resolute. Authority, he knew, is meaningless without action. Words, no matter how carefully chosen, must be backed by enforceable measures. And so, behind palace doors, the king prepared to execute a plan that would redefine the relationship between father and son, between the monarchy and the public, and between tradition and individual rebellion. The meeting concluded with clear instructions. Legal teams were tasked with drafting formal notices. Security arrangements were reviewed. Communication strategies were rehearsed. Every detail was considered, every contingency accounted for. And through it all, Charles maintained his composure, a calm exterior belying the emotional intensity beneath. As the advisors left the room, the king lingered, staring at the desk where the letter had first been drafted. He felt the weight of inevitability. The next steps were clear. The consequences would unfold, and there was no turning back. But even as he contemplated the forthcoming actions, a sense of foreboding crept in. There was an unpredictability to human behavior, especially when pride, independence, and emotion collide. He understood that once the measures were in motion, reactions could be swift, unpredictable, and far-reaching. Yet the king also knew that inaction was no longer an option. And then came a thought that sent a chill through the room. What if this decision, necessary as it was, triggered a chain of events that the monarchy could not control? What if the son, once constrained by privilege and tradition, reacted in ways no one could predict? The answer was unknowable. But one thing was certain. The king had reached his breaking point. The line had been drawn. The boundaries had been established. The consequences, though not yet fully realized, were imminent. And just when the king believed the storm was contained behind palace walls, a whisper of information arrived that none of the advisors had anticipated. A private source, one loyal yet independent, hinted at a reaction that could escalate matters beyond anyone's control. The king paused, considering the implications. The next moves, the next decisions, the next confrontations, all were poised to redefine the royal family and its place in history. And then, as the quiet tension filled the room once more, Charles understood. The breaking point had passed. There was no going back. And the first real confrontation, the one that would test loyalties, emotions, and authority, was about to begin. But what came next? The private conversation that would set everything in motion, would change everything for both father and son, and no one saw it coming. The palace never sleeps, not in the conventional sense. Even when corridors appear silent and chandeliers flicker under the faint glow of evening lamps, life moves behind doors that the public will never see. And on this particular night, the tension inside the palace was electric, almost tangible. It wasn't the first secret meeting of its kind, but it might have been the most consequential. Advisors, aides, and senior officials gathered in hushed urgency, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old carpets, their faces tight with anxiety. The meeting had been called because Charles's decision, the revocation of privileges, the restriction of access, the subtle but unmistakable warning, had caused a stir that advisors could neither ignore nor fully control. Some had anticipated resistance, but not the depth of internal division that was now becoming evident. Whispers spread quickly, and subtle factions began to emerge, each aligned with different philosophies about loyalty, modernity, and tradition. On one side were the traditionalists, those who believed that the monarchy's authority must be absolute, that a son's rebellion, no matter how public or private, must be addressed decisively to protect the institution. They argued quietly but firmly. Hesitation would be perceived as weakness. Delay would embolden further dissent. The king had made the right call, and now it was the palace's responsibility to ensure that it was executed without compromise. On the other side were the reformists, advisors who feared that the measures, though perhaps justified in principle, were extreme in execution. They worried about international perception, the potential for public outrage, and the long-term consequences on the monarchy's reputation. They argued that while boundaries were necessary, the tone and method of enforcement could be softened. A strategic communication plan, a measured approach, a chance for reconciliation before lines became unbridgeable. Tensions escalated quickly. The traditionalists accused the reformists of naivety, of being too concerned with optics and not enough with loyalty. The reformists countered that pride and impulsivity could lead to irreversible damage, that the king's authority could survive without alienating a son whose public image commanded global attention. And in the middle of it all, the king listened, weighing every argument, analyzing every possible outcome. The advisors had forgotten one thing. Charles had reached his own breaking point. He had considered every perspective, every strategy, every long-term implication. He had allowed debates to unfold, listened with patience, but ultimately, he would not be swayed by fear of public opinion or the comfort of appeasement. The monarchy's integrity, in his eyes, demanded action. And so, despite the murmured arguments, the whispered warnings, the subtle threats of backlash, he remained steadfast. Then someone stepped forward, an advisor not typically vocal, whose influence was often understated but whose intellect was respected. The room went quiet as the advisor presented a proposal. It was not aggressive, not confrontational, yet its implications were radical. It suggested a level of enforcement so unprecedented that even some traditionalists hesitated. The proposal outlined a structured plan: formal revocation of privileges, reassignment of roles, restrictions on travel, and carefully worded private warnings, all designed to reassert the king's authority while maintaining a semblance of dignity. The room buzzed with unease. Some advisors exchanged worried glances, recognizing the audacity of the plan. Others nodded subtly, understanding that precision, decisiveness, and strategic subtlety were exactly what was needed. The king, however, remained unreadable, a calm eye amidst the storm of opinions, weighing the merits and risks with meticulous care. Discussions continued late into the night. Every possible scenario was dissected. How would Harry respond? How would the public perceive the move? What were the legal implications? Could the plan be implemented without creating irreparable tension between father and son? Each question was met with counterpoints, objections, and cautious agreement. By the early hours, it became clear that consensus would not be reached. Factions remained, tensions simmered, and the weight of potential outcomes pressed heavily on everyone in the room. Amidst the debate, a critical realization emerged. While the advisors quarreled over details, the ultimate responsibility rested solely with the king. The letter had been sent, the boundaries had been drawn. The discussion was not about whether action should occur. It was about execution, timing, and tone. And that realization, as the king silently observed, left no room for hesitation. At one point, a senior aide, nervous and wary, whispered a concern that had been growing all evening. "Sir," the aide said carefully, "what if the public interprets this as vindictive? What if he refuses to comply, and the story becomes a scandal that eclipses everything else?" The king's eyes did not waver. His voice, low and measured, replied, "We act not for the public alone. We act for the institution, for the principle, for the precedent. If we falter out of fear, We fail in every sense. The room fell silent. No one argued further. They understood the gravity. The plan would proceed, and the king's authority would guide its implementation. But even as this clarity settled over the advisors, a tension lingered. The kind that only comes when human behavior is unpredictable, when emotion intersects with power, when decisions ripple far beyond their immediate context. And then, unexpectedly, another advisor spoke up, quiet at first, hesitant, almost fearful of the room's intensity. Yet the words, when delivered, cut through the atmosphere. "Sir, there is one risk none of us can control." His reaction, it may not be contained. He is unpredictable, and pride can drive even the wisest to extremes. The room froze. Every head turned to the king, whose expression remained calm but thoughtful. The advisor's warning was simple, almost obvious, yet chilling. The son's response could redefine the plan, could shift the power dynamics in ways no one anticipated. Charles considered the words carefully. He knew this. He had accounted for this. Yet even with all the planning, all the legal strategies, all the advisory input, the human element, the volatile, emotional, and unquantifiable factor, remained. And that uncertainty carried weight heavier than any protocol, heavier than any privilege, heavier than any precedent. As the night wore on, the meeting concluded, but not with resolution. It ended with awareness. Everyone present understood that they were on the precipice of history. Decisions had been made. Actions were imminent. But the outcomes, particularly those dictated by human emotion, were unknowable. And as the advisors dispersed, whispers of doubt and speculation followed them. Each step down the quiet corridors carried both anticipation and dread. Every footfall echoed in the marble halls, a reminder that behind these doors, history was in motion, and that the next moves would not only define the relationship between father and son, but also the legacy of the crown itself. But just when it seemed the plan was set, a single revelation arrived. One that no one had anticipated, one that threatened to upend even the most carefully orchestrated strategy. A source within the inner circle had observed something unexpected, a private communication, a reaction, a decision made in secrecy that could change the course of everything. And what came next, the next move that neither advisors nor king could fully predict, would escalate the situation beyond anything anyone had imagined. Privileges, titles, access, ceremonial roles. They may sound like mere perks to outsiders, trivial appendages of a royal life many view as gilded or distant. But within the walls of the palace, these privileges are the very essence of identity, authority, and belonging. And in this chapter of our story, it was precisely these privileges, the very markers of a prince's life, that were being challenged, quietly yet decisively. The morning began like any other, but for Harry, there was an unspoken weight pressing down from the moment he opened his eyes. The letter had set the stage, and whispers of upcoming meetings, subtle restrictions, and shifting expectations had started to circulate among his inner circle. Every step felt heavier. Every interaction seemed measured. And as he moved through the familiar spaces of his world, corridors, offices, private quarters, a stark reality emerged. The privileges he had assumed were immutable were now under scrutiny. First, consider ceremonial duties. For a prince, these are not mere formalities. They are symbols of recognition, honor, and trust. Attending state ceremonies, presiding over events, representing the crown abroad. Each role is both a responsibility and a reinforcement of identity. Yet, according to sources within the palace, discussions had begun to reassign or entirely remove several key ceremonial roles previously reserved for Harry. These were not arbitrary adjustments. They were strategic recalibrations designed to send a clear signal. Authority is conditional, respect is earned, and tradition does not exempt you from accountability. Then there were access privileges. The ability to enter certain residences, participate in private family councils, or engage in decision-making meetings. Privilege is power, and power is control. By limiting these avenues, the king effectively created boundaries that were impossible to ignore. Every door closed was a reminder that autonomy comes with responsibility, and that even those born into proximity to the crown are not immune to rules. Security provisions were another sensitive area. Royal security is not simply about protection. It is a tangible acknowledgement of value and status. Changing security protocols, reallocating personnel, or limiting access to certain personnel may appear technical, but in context, they signal profound shifts in trust, authority, and perception. For Harry, every adjustment communicated a subtle but unmistakable message. The safety nets that once reinforced his freedom were no longer guaranteed. Perhaps most emotionally charged were the privileges tied directly to recognition and lineage, symbolic gestures, honors, and titles that carry centuries of tradition. Stripping or restricting these privileges is not just administrative, it is deeply personal. It challenges identity. It questions belonging. And for a son navigating a complex relationship with his father, such moves are interpreted as both corrective and punitive. As Harry absorbed the implications, advisors worked behind the scenes to manage the fallout. Communication was strategic, measured, and precise. Public perception had to be considered, but even more pressing were private consequences. How these shifts would impact relationships, influence decisions, and shape emotional responses. Every adjustment was calculated, designed to convey firmness while minimizing irreparable harm. But the human element, as always, introduced uncertainty. How would Harry react? Would he accept boundaries or resist them? Would he confront, retreat, or escalate? This was more than a logistical adjustment. It was a psychological strategy, a test of endurance, and a demonstration of authority. And as word of these changes began to circulate, even subtly, tensions rose. Allies and friends debated the fairness, the necessity, and the long-term consequences. Some argued that the moves were essential for maintaining discipline and institutional integrity. Others warned that overreach could backfire, intensifying conflict and drawing public scrutiny. Amidst all this, Harry's personal response was evolving. Shock gave way to introspection. Anger simmered beneath the surface, occasionally visible in terse conversations or private communications. But there was also a dawning recognition. The privileges he had taken for granted were privileges, not rights. Every role, every honor, every symbol of status carried expectations, and failing to meet them had consequences. The king's actions, though harsh, were consistent with a principle that had guided the monarchy for centuries. Respect the institution, and it will protect you. Defy it, and boundaries will be enforced. And yet, human emotion is never simple. Privileges are intertwined with pride, identity, and family history. Losing them is not merely inconvenient. It is a profound psychological adjustment. For Harry, who had built a life balancing personal autonomy with public duty, this recalibration was both threatening and revealing. It forced him to confront questions he had long avoided. What does being a prince truly mean? How much of my identity is tied to titles, recognition, and access? And how much of my self-worth can survive when those symbols are stripped away? Within the palace, discussions about these changes continued, often in hushed tones. Senior aides, legal counselors, and household officials debated implementation strategies, timing, and messaging. Every detail was considered, every potential reaction mapped. And yet, despite all planning, there remained an undeniable tension, the human variable. Emotional responses are unpredictable, and when pride, family loyalty, and public scrutiny converge, outcomes are never guaranteed. The first indications of Harry's awareness of these changes were subtle. A hesitation in conversation, a pause before accepting invitations, a quiet withdrawal from certain engagements. Advisors monitored these signals carefully, understanding that even minor gestures could reveal the depth of emotional response and inform future decisions. But privileges are more than ceremonial or administrative. They are relational. They signify trust, recognition, and intimacy within the family and institution. By altering them, the king was sending a clear message. Authority has limits, respect must be earned, and the bonds of family are intertwined with responsibility. This is not merely policy. It is a profound statement about identity, loyalty, and consequence. And yet, the king's actions were not solely punitive. There was a strategy, a structure, a deliberate plan to allow for response, reflection, and potential reconciliation. The goal was not to humiliate, but to assert boundaries, to protect the institution, and to remind all parties, especially the son, that privilege is inseparable from duty. But as Harry contemplated these changes, a question loomed larger than any practical adjustment. What would he do next? Would he accept the redefined roles, the revised access, the subtle but unmistakable limitations? Or would he push back, challenge authority, and risk escalating a conflict that could have irreversible consequences for both his personal life and the monarchy itself? And in the quiet of that realization, another truth became clear. The privileges once assumed to be permanent were never truly his to keep. They were, in the end, conditional. And when the conditions were no longer met, they could be revoked, silently, strategically, and completely. But even as the implications settled in, another, more personal consequence lingered. The most painful privilege of all, the one tied to belonging, love, and recognition from his father, had yet to be addressed. That final, intangible symbol of acceptance, trust, and familial connection was now hanging in the balance, its fate uncertain. And just when it seemed the adjustments were complete, a revelation arrived that would shift everything. A detail so unexpected, so quietly insidious, that even advisors were caught off guard. It wasn't merely the removal of privileges, but the subtle warning embedded within the changes, a foreshadowing of consequences that would escalate if boundaries were ignored. What came next? The response to these changes, the confrontation between father and son, and the unfolding consequences, would set the stage for a dramatic escalation, one that no one could have anticipated. The moment Harry fully understood the scope of the king's decision, a storm of emotions hit him all at once. It was as if the quiet palace corridors, the muted chandeliers, and the carefully composed walls were suddenly closing in. Shock, denial, anger, confusion, and somewhere deep inside, a creeping, stubborn defiance that refused to bow quietly. For a man who had navigated life with a mixture of public scrutiny and private autonomy, this was unlike anything he had faced before. The first reaction was disbelief. He reread the letter, checking for errors, imagining that perhaps he had misinterpreted some nuance. But no, the words were deliberate, precise, and unmistakable. Privileges stripped, access curtailed, boundaries reinforced. The warning was real. The consequences were real, and the authority behind them was absolute. He paced the private quarters, fists clenched at his sides, heart hammering with a mix of fury and frustration. How had it come to this? He asked himself, not for the first time, whether his choices, the interviews, the memoir, the public statements, had crossed an invisible line that even he hadn't anticipated. Was it recklessness, naivety, or just a miscalculation in reading the dynamics of the palace? Denial came next. Perhaps it was temporary. Perhaps the king would relent, reconsider, or allow for some compromise. Perhaps the advisors would intervene, mediate, or soften the blow. Maybe all of it was a test, a temporary assertion of authority designed to gauge his reaction. Surely it couldn't be permanent, could it? But the denial gave way to anger, a raw, simmering energy that demanded expression. Conversations with close allies became punctuated by sharp tones, clipped words, and silent glances that spoke volumes. Advisors and confidants watched as the storm of emotion unfolded, unsure whether to intervene or wait for the tide to recede. Harry was wrestling not only with the loss of privileges, but with the symbolism behind the decisions, a subtle message from his father that trust, access, and identity could be withdrawn. Amid the anger was defiance. Harry had spent years cultivating a life independent of royal constraints, forging a path that blended public advocacy, personal ambition, and a desire for autonomy. The king's actions, however justified, were perceived as a direct challenge to that independence. And the natural human response to challenge, especially when pride is involved, is resistance. He considered ways to push back, to assert himself, to reclaim what he felt was his by birthright and by merit. Yet, even in defiance, there was a measured calculation. This was not impulsive rebellion. It was strategic. Harry understood the optics, the potential fallout, and the personal risks. Every move had to be deliberate, balanced against the emotional drive to retaliate. He could confront publicly, escalate privately, or withdraw temporarily to recalibrate. Each choice carried consequences, both immediate and long-term. As he wrestled with his emotions, Harry began to reflect on the implications of the privileges that had been removed. Security adjustments, ceremonial exclusions, and restricted access were not just inconveniences. They were statements about trust, loyalty, and authority. They symbolized the conditional nature of privilege and the fragile balance between personal autonomy and institutional expectation. He also considered the personal dimension. The privileges removed were more than functional, they were relational. They represented acknowledgement, approval, and connection with his father. Losing them was not just administrative. It was an emotional blow, a reminder that familial bonds are intertwined with responsibility and behavior. Private conversations grew more intense. Advisors, sensing the mounting tension, tried to offer counsel. Some urged caution, suggesting measured responses, private negotiations, or calculated silence. Others encouraged assertion, arguing that perceived weakness would only embolden restrictions and further diminish authority. Each piece of advice added complexity to Harry's decision-making process, forcing him to weigh loyalty, pride, and strategy simultaneously. Despite the storm of conflicting emotions and advice, a sense of clarity began to emerge. Harry realized that this moment, however painful, also presented an opportunity. It was an inflection point, a chance to define his autonomy within the context of family and tradition. He could respond with measured diplomacy, public assertiveness, or private negotiation, each choice shaping the narrative, his identity, and the future of his relationships. But clarity did not eliminate emotional intensity. Nightly reflections were haunted by questions. Was this truly a rupture or a challenge? Would compliance signal weakness or wisdom? Could reconciliation ever occur if boundaries were enforced so firmly? And most importantly, what was the cost, personal, familial, and public, of either path? In the midst of this internal reckoning, Harry made a pivotal decision. He would act. Not impulsively, not recklessly, but decisively. He would communicate, assert, and respond. And though he did not yet know the full consequences of this choice, he understood one immutable truth: inaction was not an option. His first move was a phone call, discreet, direct, and fraught with tension. One of his closest confidants answered, immediately sensing the weight in his voice. Words were chosen carefully, pauses filled with intent, and every sentence carried emotional resonance. Behind the call lay a clear objective: to gauge, to plan, and to assert. This was not simply a response. It was the opening salvo in a confrontation that would test loyalty, authority, and identity. Meanwhile, advisors continued to monitor signals from both sides. Every nuance, hesitation, and reaction was interpreted, analyzed, and weighed. The palace had learned over centuries that emotion, when intertwined with power, can alter outcomes as significantly as formal decisions. And Harry's reaction, full of shock, denial, and defiance, was a variable no one could fully predict or control. Yet amid the intensity, there was a paradox. The very emotions that fueled defiance also opened the door to reflection. Harry, despite anger and hurt, began to consider the broader implications: the preservation of relationships, the safeguarding of legacy, and the potential to navigate this conflict strategically rather than destructively. In other words, the storm of emotion was also a moment of opportunity, if he could channel it effectively. And then came an unexpected realization. The king's actions, while severe, were deliberate, measured, and nuanced. They were not meant to destroy, but to recalibrate. They were not punitive for punishment's sake, but corrective, signaling a boundary that could define both father and son, if approached wisely. Yet even with this understanding, tension persisted. The stakes were enormous, the emotional intensity unrelenting, and the potential for miscalculation ever present. How Harry chose to respond next would ripple far beyond personal grievances, affecting public perception, familial relationships, and the very fabric of the institution itself. And just as he prepared for the next step, a quiet knock on the door signaled another piece of information, a new variable, a private insight that no advisor had anticipated. What came next? The unfolding consequences of this reaction would escalate the situation beyond anything imagined. forcing both father and son into uncharted territory. Even in royal households, there comes a moment when formality cannot convey the gravity of a situation. And for King Charles, that moment had arrived. The privileges had been revoked. Boundaries were drawn. And now, after careful deliberation, he felt compelled to deliver a message. Not through letters, intermediaries, or public statements, but directly. A warning. One that would test the son's understanding of consequence, loyalty, and the weight of heritage. The room where the conversation would take place was intimate yet imposing. Heavy drapes muted the afternoon sun, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the tension between father and son. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, silent observers to a confrontation centuries in the making. Every element, the furniture, the lighting, the silence, amplified the stakes. Charles entered with measured composure. There was no anger in his posture, no harshness in his voice, no dramatic flourish to signal dominance. Instead, there was calm authority, a deliberate balance between paternal concern and monarchical duty. Every step, every word, every pause was calculated to convey significance. He knew that tone, intent, and delivery mattered as much as content. Harry waited, aware that this was no ordinary meeting. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, past grievances, and the shared weight of public scrutiny. He had anticipated some form of communication, but nothing could prepare him for the gravity that permeated the room. From the very first glance, he understood. This was the moment where decisions, warnings, and consequences converged. The king began softly, acknowledging their shared history, the complexities of their relationship, and the challenges of navigating life within the monarchy. His words were calm, almost conversational, yet underlaid with an unmistakable firmness. There was no room for debate. This was not an appeal. This was a declaration, a boundary drawn in language both measured and absolute. You need to understand, the king said, voice steady, that privileges are not permanent. They are conditional. Access, roles, and responsibilities carry obligations. When these are ignored or undermined, consequences follow. This is not personal, it is principle. Harry listened, tension coiling in his chest. The phrasing was deliberate, each word a reminder of authority and expectation. It was neither accusatory nor vindictive, but the implications were clear. Boundaries had been crossed, and further disregard would not be tolerated. The warning extended beyond administrative measures. Charles emphasized the broader ramifications, public perception, institutional stability, and the historical precedent for maintaining order within the royal family. He outlined scenarios in which continued defiance could have escalating consequences, not as threats, but as unavoidable realities rooted in centuries of tradition. Yet, even as the warning was delivered, there was an unmistakable undertone of paternal concern. The king recognized the emotional stakes, the personal dimensions, and the potential for alienation. He spoke not just as a monarch, but as a father, striving to guide, to correct, to instill understanding without severing connection. Harry's reaction was a mix of apprehension and defiance. He understood the authority behind the words, yet pride and independence clashed with submission. The tension in the room was palpable, a dance of power, emotion, and legacy. Every pause, glance, and gesture carried meaning. The warning was clear, but its reception remained uncertain. Advisors, though outside the room, had orchestrated the context for this meeting with precision. They recognized that private communication of this nature could have far-reaching consequences, and they had prepared contingency plans for various outcomes. Yet, even with careful planning, the unpredictability of human emotion loomed large. Harry's response, volatile and nuanced, could redefine the trajectory of this conflict. The king paused, allowing the words to resonate, giving space for reflection. He understood that true impact required comprehension, not mere acknowledgement. Silence, in this context, was a tool, a means of reinforcing the weight of authority without the need for volume or aggression. Harry, in that silence, felt the enormity of the situation. The warning was not merely about revoked privileges or restricted access. It was a statement about the nature of responsibility, the consequences of choices, and the delicate balance between autonomy and obligation. He began to realize that every past decision, public statements, memoirs, interviews, had contributed to this moment. The warning was both a boundary and a mirror, reflecting actions, attitudes, and intentions. And yet, as the conversation unfolded, Harry detected subtle nuances in his father's tone, concern tempered with pragmatism, authority balanced with empathy, firmness softened by familial connection. It was a complex communication, one that demanded careful interpretation and measured response. As the meeting concluded, the king left with a quiet but unmistakable message. Respect the boundaries, understand the consequences, and recognize that privilege and access are inseparable from responsibility. The room remained heavy with emotion, the air thick with reflection, anticipation, and the unspoken question, what comes next? Outside the private chambers, the implications of the warning began to ripple through the palace. Advisors debriefed, staff speculated, and the quiet anticipation of potential escalation hung over every corridor. The warning was delivered, but its effect, compliance, resistance, or something entirely unexpected, remained to be seen. For Harry, the conversation marked a turning point. It crystallized the reality he had been slowly confronting, that privileges could be revoked, access could be limited, and authority could be asserted with precision. But more than that, it forced him to consider choices with gravity he had never fully appreciated. Every move from this point forward carried consequence. Every decision weighed against both personal desire and familial expectation. And as he contemplated the warning, a new realization emerged. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. This was not merely about privileges, roles, or titles. It was about identity, legacy, and the tenuous bridge between independence and responsibility. But what came next? The first act in response to the warning, the subtle maneuvers that would test both son and father, would ignite tensions, expose fractures, and set a trajectory that neither could have anticipated. No palace decision exists in isolation, not in an age where every whisper can become a headline and every private action has the potential to go public. And for Harry, the warning and revocation of privileges were no exception. Within hours, fragments of information, carefully curated, subtly leaked, and strategically placed, began to surface, igniting a media storm that few could have anticipated. It started with a single report, an anonymous source, vaguely described as close to the royal family, hinted at tensions between father and son. The article was brief, speculative, but the insinuation was clear. A prince was facing consequences unprecedented in modern memory. The public, ever hungry for royal drama, seized upon the story, sharing, commenting, and analyzing every possible angle. Social media erupted. Traditional news outlets followed, each trying to outdo the other with interpretations, expert commentary, and historical context. For Harry, the leak was jarring. The private boundaries enforced by the king, the carefully structured warning, and the personal deliberations that had defined the past few weeks were suddenly being dissected in public forums. Every word, every gesture, every decision was open to interpretation. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that privacy in royal life is an illusion, especially when tension intersects with public curiosity. The media storm was not just reactive, it was strategic. Observers noted that leaks often coincided with pivotal palace events, carefully timed to maximize impact. Speculation ran rampant. Were privileges revoked permanently? Was this a prelude to a public confrontation? Were advisors siding with father or son? Each question fueled further coverage. Each rumor magnified tension, and each analysis contributed to a sense of escalating crisis. Harry's advisors scrambled to manage the fallout. Communications teams drafted statements, prepared talking points, and considered both reactive and proactive strategies. Legal counsel weighed the possibility of addressing inaccuracies, while PR specialists debated the wisdom of silence versus engagement. Every action, or inaction, carried consequences. Every public perception had to be anticipated, countered, or leveraged. Yet, even amid the chaos, Harry had to navigate his own emotional landscape. The public scrutiny compounded the stress already imposed by the warning and revoked privileges. He grappled with frustration, humiliation, and a sense of betrayal, not just by circumstance, but by the perception of control slipping from his grasp. It was one thing to face consequences privately. It was another to have them amplified, dissected, and debated before a global audience. The leaks also intensified personal reflection. Harry considered past choices, public statements, and private actions that may have contributed to this moment. Every interview, memoir excerpt, and social media post was now under scrutiny. The realization was sobering. Personal autonomy is never absolute, particularly when actions intersect with family legacy, public expectation, and historical precedent. Meanwhile, the palace faced its own challenges. Advisors debated whether to counter the leaks, issue clarifying statements, or maintain strict silence. Each path carried risk. Speaking out could validate the story, draw more attention, or escalate conflict. Remaining silent could fuel speculation, allow narratives to solidify, or undermine authority. The balancing act was delicate, fraught with tension, and fraught with potential missteps. Harry, observing the storm, understood that control had shifted, not entirely, but in part, to forces beyond his immediate influence. Public opinion, media narratives, and global scrutiny became variables in a game he had not anticipated. The emotional intensity of the private conflict now collided with the relentless pressure of public perception, amplifying stakes and creating a feedback loop of tension and reaction. In response, Harry began formulating strategies. He weighed direct communication, selective leaks, public appearances, and private negotiations. Each option had potential benefit and risk. Each decision had implications for authority, reputation, and familial relationships. The complexity was overwhelming, and yet the need for decisive action was undeniable. Amid this storm, unexpected opportunities emerged. Analysts speculated that media attention, while stressful, could also provide leverage. By controlling narrative threads, emphasizing context, and highlighting personal perspective, Harry could potentially shift public perception, reclaim narrative control, and influence both advisors and the king indirectly. But the margin for error was narrow. Missteps could exacerbate conflict, undermine credibility, or inflame family tensions further. The leaks also prompted introspection about legacy and identity. Harry realized that privileges, while significant, were only part of a larger equation. Public perception, familial approval, and personal values now intersected in ways that could redefine his role, influence, and relationships. Decisions could no longer be made solely in isolation. Every choice had a cascading effect, reverberating across media, family, and the institution itself. And yet, amid the chaos and emotional intensity, one critical question emerged. How would the king respond to this public escalation? The warning had been delivered privately, yet the consequences were now visible to the world.